Hello. As important as the writing, the rules, the business, and the art of Warhammer have been to the phenomenal success story that is Games Workshop, it's hard to imagine the miniature wargame having been such a success without the miniatures themselves. My guest today is one of the absolute greats, Trish Carden, who joined Games Workshop in the 80s to start creating belligerent beastmen and marvellous monsters. With Aly Morrison, she helped co-create Marauder Miniatures, a range of fantasy miniatures that would be sold alongside the Citadel ranges, and she would go on to be incredibly famous for some of the greatest monsters in Warhammer history. A contributor to what many would call the golden age of Citadel Miniatures, Trish would eventually go on to work with Forge World to create even larger and more impressive beasts. We talk about the path that led to her creating and sculpting fantasy miniatures in the first place, what it was like to work at Citadel in the early days, and the excitement of Marauder, and a lifetime of making magical monsters. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Trish Carden. Trish, thank you for joining me. It's great to be speaking with you.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to.
I like to start by just getting a bit of an understanding of, I guess, your journey into miniatures and fantasy and that sort of stuff. So, like, what was where did that begin for you, and how
Where
did
did it
you
begin?
end up in miniatures?
Probably as a child, really. I grew up loving nature. Was never in the house when I was a kid. We were always out on the push bikes, in the woods. I grew up on the outskirts of Edinburgh,
Right.
which was quite a countryside area, the bit I was in. And so we were out in the push bikes in the woods, and it really began to sort of make me realize the natural world was so important to me. And I remember friends and I, one of my friends went over the back wall of her garden into the woods quite often, went a little way. There was a clearing, and in the clearing there was this dead tree. It had been struck by lightning. Right. And we called it Murphy. It was white because all the bark had come off. And it was a very fairy tale place. And I began to sort of imagine the creatures that would live there. Things began to sort of percolate in the childish brain. As well, I had two aunts who lived with us when I was younger. They were both school teachers. One had been a headmistress, and they took it upon them, to help me start reading, myself and my brother, whether we wanted to or not, before. But one of the ways they did it was they would read me fairy tales, proper fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales, the good stuff, not the sort of adapted for children rubber stuff.
Yeah.
And that opened my eyes to a fantastical world. That was something that I just read continually. I became a real avid reader, and went from that to reading, along with the fairy tales and things. I got fascinated by the natural world. I would read books about animal behavior. I wasn't really reading novels as such. I was reading reference books about nature and anthropology and all that sort of thing. And all these things began to foster this feeling that this was a core interest of mine. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it at the time. I studied at school geography and stuff like that. And at one point I thought, maybe I'll go into being some sort of research geographist, go into the research stuff, or an anthropologist or something like this. I did art at school because I'd always drawn. That was another thing I'd always done. But all my drawings were sort of animals or charts about skeletons and all that sort of thing. I'd grown up with a wonderful collection of zoo animals, the beautiful ones,
right,
that were very accurate, which went on to dinosaurs as well. I had a collection of them, and they were wonderful because they were very accurate. And again, I used to spend hours looking at them, looking at the textures, looking at the way they were made, and began to get this sort of idea that actually somebody made these. They didn't just appear on my carpet for me to play with. Somebody somewhere had made these. And this was another little piece of the jigsaw puzzle, carried on. My brother used to make airfix kits. You'd walk into his bedroom and there'd be like a dog fight going on hanging from the ceiling,
Yeah.
And I got, oh, yeah, this is interesting. And I built a few myself. I think I did a Messerschmitt and SS Canberra at one point, and, and again, it was this thing that, I'm using paint, I'm putting stuff together. Somebody's made these originally, haven't they? It was, again, another one of those moments. So back to school, I did an art O-level, but I wasn't that involved in going on. I had decided I wasn't going to do art as an A-level. I was going to continue with doing my geography and things like that, until in my 5th year at secondary school, I met this amazing art teacher. I never thought I was good enough to do anything with art, to be fair. And he encouraged me. He was wonderful, Mr. Campbell. I'll always remember him. And he said, look, you could do an A-level. It was a higher, but the equivalent of an A-level. You could do this, you could go to art college, you could, and he says, but you have to do this in 1 year. You usually get 2 years, but you'd have to stay in 6th form and do this. And thought, oh, okay. And I thought about it. I thought, you know what? Yeah, this sounds like me. So I spent a whole year virtually doing nothing but art in my final year at school. And I spent a lot of time in the zoo and in the museum. Edinburgh had a wonderful zoo that some old friends of mine and I, we used to go every Saturday. We were in this zoo club, for kids. Right. And we got to know the keepers and got to handle animals. You would find us in the reptile house with snakes round our necks and, stuff like that. But I also got to meet the director of the zoo, who, my dad was a big golfer. He played golf with them. Mm-hmm. And he had hand-reared a cheetah called Scrap. And I remember one day Dad said, I've spoken to Mr. Fisher. He says you can come in and meet the cheetah. So in we go, my brother and I, to the zoo, taken in to the back of the cheetah enclosure. And there's this huge animal purring, oh my God, And we were allowed to feed him. And at one point I had, you can imagine this cheetah paws up on my shoulders, licking my cheek, just about taking the skin and the flesh. I could see him, I could feel the fur, I could smell him. It was another of those moments where the natural world became closer. And my desire to do something in an artistic way with it became closer. And we also, my dad also used to take us to the museum, where it had this huge collection of taxidermied animals. So I was able to spend time in there studying all the creatures. And so when I started to do this A-level, I went back to the museum and to the zoo to sketch. And I spent so much time in the museum that the staff got to know me. And I met the woman who was in charge of the taxidermy section, who actually did a lot of the newer taxidermy, but restored all the old stuff. So she said, do you want to come in behind the scenes and have a look at all our collections? And well, she says, there's 10 times as much behind the scenes as is out. So, yeah. So off I trotted, and there were these drawers full of bones and skulls and animal skins, and she had stuff all over the place that she was in the middle of working on, and all the false eyes. And again, it was that moment of, there's things you can do that are crafts and creative, to be making with your hands, making this sort of stuff. And she very kindly said to me, look, there's lots of stuff here. If you want to borrow any of it to take into school, to sketch and paint, because I decided for my main project, for my portfolio, I was going to do a series of sketches and paintings about British wildlife.
Right.
So I ended up at various times going at home and then into school on the bus with stuffed animals on my knee. The biggest one was a badger. In those days, you didn't get on the bus and pay as you got on. You went, sat down, and a conductor would come and take your money. And of course, you always got the comedian who's, you're paying for that. Yeah, it's taking up a whole seat. So I'd be sitting there with this monstrous badger sitting on my knee. But again, I spent a lot of time doing that, getting really involved with the whole thing, and went on eventually to the art college in Edinburgh, with the idea that I was going to do like graphics and illustration. I wanted to illustrate animals in some way, nature. So the first year you got to try a bit of everything. We got to do some sculpture, which was a bit of an eye-opener for me. You get to use clay, carve stone, and I thought, okay. We got to do weaving. I did stained glass, I did the jewelry, I did all sorts of things, and fell in love with jewelry design.
Right.
Totally changed my mind about what I wanted to do, as you do, women's prerogative, and began to do jewelry and silversmithing. And I was using silver and gold a lot, but I also wanted to use organic materials. I was fascinated by the organic feel of things. That was what, not the hardness of metal, but things like wood.
Right.
And near where I was staying, there was a shop where the chap used to make violins and violas, various instruments like that. And I'd gone into the shop one day and asked him if he had any offcuts of wood that I could use to put in my jewelry. So I went back out with a huge box full of rosewood, mahogany, ebony, wonderful stuff, woods I'd never seen before. And another friend, her father he built and restored harpsichords and various ancient musical instruments, piano type instruments. And he gave me lots of offcuts of ebony and ivory from old keys. So I began to use that in my jewelry. And I was really enjoying beginning to carve it and work it. Again, I always seemed to be tending towards the carving and the manipulating of an organic sort of thing. And one day I met this chap who I started seeing, who happened to be a friend of Aly's, Aly Morrison. And I got to know him. And this was like, wow, I hadn't seen anything. He was sculpting for lots of the historical companies at the time, Mike's Models, I think it was Tabletop Games, I think it was.
Right.
A lot of 15mm, all historical. But I had never seen anything remotely like this before. The only toy soldiers I'd ever seen, if you could call them that, were those plastic bags of really bad, World War II stuff that my brother had, and he had, Action Man and stuff like that. And we used to get into trouble. I remember he and I, he'd been given an air rifle for Christmas one year, and we took the heads off all his action men and my Barbie and my Cindy and filled them with red paint and then shot them to see what would happen. We got in such trouble. But anyway, I digress. yeah, I saw what Aly was making, and he was using milliput for most of the stuff. So he'd given me some to play with, and I started to make little bits to add to my jewelry. So I was sculpting little heads, little animals, sort of things that I was adding into the jewelry. And eventually, I split up with Sky, and Aly and I started going out together. And we decided we wanted to get married and buy a flat. And we were both self-employed at the time. I'd left the uni. I'd set up a little business doing jewelry and silversmithing. I was working from a room in my dentist's surgery, which was great. All I could hear was in the background, you know. But I earned a little bit of extra money from him by making, when he took, you know, for somebody to get false teeth, you know, they take an impression, and then he'd send me into the room and I'd mix the plaster, pour it, make the, you know.
Or like casting the
like casting the teeth, you know. But again, you're using something, you're learning.
Yeah.
And all through this, I'm thinking it's becoming more obvious to me that there is a thing here where there's a craft where you're making all these different things that people are using. And so yeah, I was doing that, and I was making little things for jewelry. And so we decided, because we wanted to buy a flat, one of us would have to have a proper job to get a mortgage. So Aly had met Bryan Ansell. He'd been put in touch, and off he trotted down to Nottingham, and was offered a job with Games Workshop. So he began to work there, and I was getting more and more interested in what he was doing. It just fascinated me, especially when he started making the fantasy figures as opposed to the historicals. And by this time, we'd got a little studio in a very old part of Edinburgh, the Grassmarket, which was above a jewellery shop. And I was doing my jewellery. He was making his miniatures. Another friend of mine was doing her jewellery. And Bob Naismith actually was with us for a little while when we got to know Bob after Aly started working with GW. And at the same time as doing my jewellery, I was working, helping. There was a woman who had a shop up the road from us who sold netsuke and inro, you know, all the Japanese sword accoutrements, the little carvings. And I used to make a bit of cash on the side by taking broken ones and repairing them. So I was using the ivory, I was using coral, I was using jet, I was using all sorts of these and they were wonderful little carvings of gods, you know, Japanese gods, heroes, animals, lovely, lovely little stuff. And then a shop at the other side, she made dolls. So I also spent time painting dolls' faces. And so I was getting more and more involved in the idea that this was something that I wanted to do, was making stuff like this. I still didn't quite know what I wanted at the time. I was still thinking jewelry business. But I decided I wanted Aly to teach me how to sculpt. So he began to show me how to use. He was using, by this time, green stuff. That's what everybody was using at Citadel. And I made this weird little beast man type thing with two heads. And he took it down to show Bryan on one of his trips. And we'd gone down there maybe 2-3 times a year, just, you know, to visit. And I'd gone with him a couple of times. And this was fascinating as well, seeing studio, the factory. There was this whole new world opened up. So anyway, he showed Bryan this figure, and Bryan offered me work.
Right, great.
So I worked freelance for him for a couple of years before I actually joined full time. Aly and I had got married by this time. Bryan and Dan had come up to the wedding. It was lovely. And we bought a flat on the 5th floor in this sort of tenement building in Edinburgh. And there's a tiny little box room that we set up as our studio. And so he was making, he'd made it was the Golden Heroes, was it? The superhero boxes.
The RPG.
RPG stuff.
Yeah.
I was doing Judge Dredd.
Right.
Perps and all sorts of stuff like that. And we were working there. And we decided, Bryan had said, do you want to come down, work down in Nottingham? So we thought about it and we thought, well, you know what, we're just ourselves, no kids, nothing to hold us. And we really were enjoying what we were doing. We were working on the miniatures all day. We were sending them down. Alan Merritt was doing a lot of the studio stuff at the time. So we'd get a letter back with lots of, change this, do that, do whatever, and we'd change it and we'd send it back down again. And it just became a way of life that was thoroughly enjoyable. And so we decided, yes, we were going to move to Nottingham. And about 18 months after we'd got married and moved into the flat, we moved down to Nottingham. And Bryan very kindly allowed us to stay in his house, which was in a village just north of Nottingham. So we stayed there for couple of months, 3 months, something like that. And got fully involved with the design studio. And 1987, I decided, right, I'm just going to go full time. And that was it. That was the beginning. I mean, we'd moved down there, and I think it was at the beginning of 86.
Right.
And that was it.
Wow. Yeah.
From then on, I was Citadel,
Sure. Yeah. Fascinating sort of almost.
It was a progression.
Sure. Yeah. Like a journey towards actually getting to, especially with the fact that the Beastmen were almost that first.
They were the very first range I made, yeah.
And to have brought together all of those different elements of the arts and the crafts and the natural world, the fairy tales, all of that stuff coming through into that.
It all fed into that
is amazing.
End result,
That's awesome.
Because I think if I hadn't been interested in all that, I don't know if I'd been interested in what he was doing, the toy soldiers, I don't know if they'd have held the same interest, but, fantasy miniatures, sculpting them, with all the interests I already had, it felt like coming home, it did.
Fascinating,
yeah.
Was it quite a culture shock then to go from just you two in your little studio, like working away and mailing stuff down, to working in, the Citadel Design Studio in a sort of more central way?
It was, in a way. It was, when we went down, it was still a very small team who were sculpting. The Perry twins were there, who were just barking. They were just bonkers. They were lovely. Love the Perry twins. So they were there. We were in Enfield Chambers in the centre of Nottingham at the time. They'd moved from all the stuff from Newark, and the factory was still up at Eastwood. But yeah, the twins were there. Jez joined. Nick Bibby had joined up. Bob Ollie was doing Iron Claw. So he would be back and forward. Then Kev Adams came. So yes, it became this room at the back of the studio of just silliness. And, it was everybody, we were all similar ages, and we were all, I suppose, how would I put this? Not your usual people, if you like. We were all into nerd stuff, and we were doing something that hadn't been done before, and just generally being able to geek out when it wasn't fashionable to geek out. So we had a little sort of band of people that became a family, and actually that was so much better than being isolated in one little room, because, you know, you were bouncing ideas off each other, you were having fun together. It just made it, the whole thing, better.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so would you literally be, you'd be briefed, okay, we need you to make a load more Beastmen or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
it might be. Would that like be, okay, a day's work is just working on one? Are you doing like lots of bits on lots of different half complete models? Or what was the
Well,
process?
for if you were doing a range, we were sculpting using green stuff, which of course, being epoxy, took time to dry.
Right.
So you would tend to have a few figures on the go at the one time, so that you would do a section on one, and then you'd put it under a light because it helped it dry. The heat would help it dry quicker, and you would go and work on something else while that was drying. So we generally had maybe 3 or 4 things from a range on the go at the same time. Right. So, which was good in some ways, because you didn't get bored with one. You could move on to the next one, you know. And it kept a cohesion and everything as well, you know.
Yeah. And there was a lot of, so like a successful miniature, you might go back and like tweak it and change it so that it's now a variant.
Yes,
model,
I mean,
right?
most of the ranges, I mean, Bryan was keen on bang for your buck,
right?
Basically, which made sense. So if the green stuff survived the moulding process well, which generally it did pretty well, it's quite tough stuff. We would make weapons out of milliput a lot of the time, and they would often break and shatter as they were taken out the mould. But the green figure often survived quite well. So we would then do a conversion, which could be anything as simple as maybe a head swap or a different weapon, maybe cutting at the waist, moving something, you know, or it could be a bit more like carving bits off and adding different bits of clothing, whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, those figures would then go and be cast again. And sometimes you would even convert a second time.
Right.
If the figure came back and was okay. So some of the ranges you see from the early days, you can look at them and you can see that base figure.
Sure.
Often, you know, in the leg position or something, and you can see, well, that's the same as that, it's the same as that, but, you know, has had different stuff done to it. So yeah, it was a way of getting more out of your time in a lot of ways, you know.
Sure.
So yeah, it worked well.
Yeah. I mean, very canny sort of business approach.
Yes.
Which I get the sense that was sort of Bryan Ansell's one of his driving visions, right? Was to make a successful business.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, you know, you're making something by hand, so it does take an amount of time. And we were all at different stages of expertise, if you like. I mean, the twins were ridiculous. They could knock something up in half an hour with a cup of tea in both hands, you know. They were just so fast.
Yeah.
But they'd been doing it since they were about 16. You know, I was a lot slower because I was relatively new to it. And, you know, some sculptors were quicker than others. Some took a long time working in detail. Some just slapped it on. But this was a way of making sure that things were getting done quicker.
Yeah.
As Citadel sold more and people wanted more, and there weren't always people who you could bring in to be sculptors. There wasn't like now where there's a huge amount of people who can sculpt. Were there to be employed, if you like.
Sure.
In those days, there were very few people. Very few people knew about it really as a career, you know.
Yeah.
So it was a way of getting more out of us in a lot of ways, you know.
Sure, makes sense.
Yeah.
What was it like working with Bryan Ansell generally?
Generally,
you know, as a boss?
He was. I like Bryan. I had a lot of respect for Bryan. He was very fair, I think, in everything, but he didn't mince words.
Right.
If you didn't like what you were doing, you knew about it. And I think he could be intimidating at times because he was so keen on getting everything just right. He had this vision and everything had to follow this vision. He knew exactly what he wanted from you, and he expected you to deliver. And I think we were kind of protected in a little way, because we would have a manager, if you like, who would do an awful lot of the the work. You know, we would talk to him and he would talk to Bryan. So we weren't, you know, he was getting shouted at rather than us. And he would come back and give us the stuff without shouting at us. But Bryan, you know, he would come in and he would, you know, look at what we were doing, and he was incredibly encouraging. Always had such good ideas about things, knew so much about so many different things. But I, you know, with the designers, he was very, he was almost fatherly. I think he was very, sort of treated us like this sort of benign father figure in a way. We were like little, you know,
right.
Nobody had a team of designers like this. You know, it was a new thing, and we were, when I say, we weren't his pets, but you know what I mean. It was that kind of.
Sure.
He liked us all to wear black, to have this, you know, vibe, if you like. It was almost like being a pop group or something. You know? Take those photos of us looking mysterious, you know, and send us to visit shops and things like that, all wearing our black and such like. And it was, I think, for him, he was able to mold us. He definitely wanted to mold us into a particular sort of thing that would create what he wanted. But yeah, I mean, he was an interesting person to work for. He was very, very friendly and very engaged, but at the same time quite aloof. He was quite a mix of characters at times, you know.
Right.
Total genius when it came to the business. Total genius. I don't think anyone else could have done what he did with Games Workshop and Citadel, you know.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very impressive, to take it from what it was, which, you know, already a successful business, but in a very different way.
Yes.
To what it would then become under Bryan Ansell and beyond.
Well, that's it. He had that vision and that idea that he could make it into this business.
Yeah.
And that he could bring wargaming to the fore and make a career for a lot of people out of it. And he had the ability to find the right people for each job.
Right.
You know, if you weren't doing a good job, again, you didn't suffer fools, so you were out, you know.
Yeah.
But he had a real talent for finding the right people and for putting them in the right place, and just finding all the right sort of elements that would take the company where he wanted it to go. And that could be frustrating at times, because it wouldn't always be what you thought it should be. You know, he would have this idea, and it's like, oh God, do we have to? You know, but actually, what he was doing made Citadel into the behemoth it's become.
Sure.
You know, it gave it its roots and its core and its soul.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. A lot of decisions, it seems, that have been vindicated in time as well, of course. You know, it's
definitely
gone on to be so successful.
Exactly. And like I said, I don't think, had Bryan not made the core company what it was, I don't think it would have taken off in the way it did. He managed to catch the imagination of so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually curious, just on that point of imagination, actually, just around almost the inspirations for, like, when you're working on the miniatures, like what I suppose just the general inspirations, whether that's music or films or books, or comics, I imagine as well. But then also like the relationship between the designers, the sculptors who are creating the miniatures, the writers who are sort of building the world, and then the artists who are illustrating it. Like, you know, would it be a miniature is created first and then that's fed back into everywhere else, or is someone drawing something, or is someone writing something?
It really varied. In the beginning, nothing was really pinned down. We were starting ranges from scratch, if you like. There was nothing that had gone before particularly. And that could be an idea a writer had. It could be some sketches an artist had done. It could be something that a sculptor had an idea for doing. It's like the Skaven, that was all Jez. Oh, I want to make these, you know, and he pushed it through. Whereas other things were had come from another place. And working in Enfield Chambers, a little maze of a place, little rooms, and you know, we spent a fair bit of our time. You know, I would spend time in a room quite often with Rick Priestley and Nigel Stillman, who were writing, and they were doing the games design and stuff like that. And you would be picking up ideas, you'd be bouncing stuff back and forth. You know, there would be, in another room, there'd be John Blanche. There was, you know, other artists doing things. And you would see something that would give you an idea for something you could do in a model, or they would see a model you were, you know, a figure you were sculpting, and they, oh, you know, do some sketches. And it was all a very organic sort of, it was just this big melting pot of ideas, really, which was a wonderful time to be there, because ideas were coming from everywhere.
Yeah. Within
the company and without the company, you know.
Sure, yeah.
And as things got bigger, ranges got established. So if you were doing, say, you know, you decided to do a range of orcs or something like that, well, maybe the twins would have done some original orcs. So you would have to sort of, to a degree, follow what had gone before, right, so that everything looked cohesive and looked like it belonged to the same range.
Right.
And it became a little bit more restrictive then. But there was still room for your own ideas and room for what you wanted to do. Sure. And you could put part of yourself into the figures, you know.
Yeah.
It was, but certainly the early days to me were some of the most fun days, because really it was just you know, bung everything in a bucket and pick out a few things and go mad, you know. It was fantastic. Just the amount of creativity that was round that, you know, it was the most creative environment I think I'd ever been in, even more than the art college, more than anything.
Right.
Just people who were passionate about what they were doing, wanted to do this amazing job. We would put, you know, we'd roll into work maybe about 10 o'clock. You know, there was no sort of 9 to 5, but we'd still be working there at 7, 8 o'clock at night. And then we'd roll off to the pub, you know. But yeah, it was just a wonderful atmosphere to be working in.
Yeah.
Just everybody encouraging, you know.
Yeah, because it sounds like also an artistic collective, as much of it's a...
It was a collective, yeah. I mean, that's a good word for it. It was definitely a collective. We were all similar ages, so, you know, we'd socialise together, and everybody became friends, and it was like a little collective of like-minded people.
Right.
You know, it was a bit us against the world in some ways, you know, because there was nothing else. We had nothing to compare it to.
Yeah.
You know, we really didn't have anything where we could say we'd seen, well, you know, you had Tom Mayer, who was working in America, who'd got involved with Workshop as well, but there was no other place really like Games Workshop at the time. Yeah. No other entity really like Citadel in the way it was run and the people who were in it, you know.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, it was very different. Yeah.
Were you finding that you're obviously working with all of those different creative talents, lots of experienced sculptors, designers, your techniques and the tools you were using and the materials, were they developing and changing over time?
Oh yeah. I mean, to begin with, we were all using green stuff. So obviously Aly and I, when we were working from our place in Edinburgh, we had the green stuff, we had some milliput, and we got the wax 5s. That's what people were using. I mean, the twins started off using cocktail sticks. And they made the most incredible stuff using cocktail sticks, which is ridiculous. I know. Who shows these sticks that were now about that thick, because there was so much dried putty on them. But, you know, but yeah, we were all bought wax 5s.
Right.
Because that was kind of the standard for sculpting in those days in some ways. And, you know, we'd have access to all these sort of metal tools. I would get when I went to the dentist, I said, have you got any old dental tools that you don't want anymore? And we would get all these awful things that they used to torture you with, and, you could bend them, you could carve them down, you could make shapes that you wanted to use. And that was basically what we were using. Maybe there was a Dremel was used for carving stuff down, but it was very simple in some ways. There wasn't a lot of different things that were used. But as workshop grew, the first thing I think was Nick Bibby became allergic to green stuff.
Right.
So he began to use polymer clay. They managed to work out that they could actually mold it okay, and it would survive the mold and stuff, and take a good impression. And so he started to use the polymer clay, which we'd never seen before, and it was relatively inert, so it didn't affect his skin. So that opened up another, there's an idea. There's something else that can be used, although it was very different to using epoxy.
Right.
And I never used that till very late on, to be honest. But as time went on, actually the green stuff in the Wax 5 stayed similar for many, many, many years because it did the job. So why change it?
Yeah.
But we would learn new techniques as other sculptors would join us or would find out more. You would learn little hints for doing things that would make your job easier, make things more efficient, perhaps. And really, an awful lot of the differences came in for me when I was working in the design studio in Citadel in the later years, and I started using Sculpey when we were doing plastics and things like that to make the 3-ups. And I discovered I far preferred polymer clay. So we were using that, and I started using wood putty to make, so this is horrible stinky stuff, but it sets off very quickly. And it was very, very hard, great for making teeth and claws and stuff like that you could then just push into the polymer clay. So I started pretty much exclusively using polymer clay. And I was, going online and finding tips of things to use, starting using the silicone tools. So, moved on to that sort of workflow, and then moving on to Forge World. I think that was the biggest change for me in things I was using, because the guys at Forge World were just incredible.
Right.
They all had these amazing ideas for using things you wouldn't think of using to sculpt with, and Keith showed me how to make saws out of razor blades and scalpels that were very, very thin, so you could cut things and they were flexible and it was easier to cut putty.
Right.
Rather than using a big jeweler's saw that took like a half millimeter chunk out the clay. And using things like ball bearings for eyes, and all these little things that just hadn't occurred.
Sure.
And people like Stuart Williamson, Phil, Mark Bedford, they all, because I think they'd grown up making dioramas and stuff like that, they just were an absolute fount of knowledge of all the different things you could use.
Yeah.
And that was another step. And I mean, that's where I learned a lot of the stuff that I use today,
Yeah.
So, it was a continual learning process, but there was a long time where it was pretty much green stuff in a Wax 5,
Sure, yeah. Yeah. Sounds like a lot of creative problem solving, for which I guess does come from diorama building and crafting and that sort of stuff as well. Yeah.
And, when we got into plastics, there was... I know you'd spoken to John Thornthwaite, and he was talking all about that. And there was a different way of going about making things then at the beginning, because you were having to make a physical model that didn't have undercuts.
Right.
So that he could lay up the molds with the clay and everything. So that was another different way of thinking, of having to think how, before, you made a figure, as long as it didn't have any obvious traps and undercuts and things, you knew it would go into a mold and it would come out and it could cope with small undercuts and stuff like that. When we started the plastics, because it was going into a metal mold, no undercuts. And for the beginning of that, you were using a clay to do it. It was the same clay that they used to make like car bodies and stuff like that.
Right.
Sort of an oil-based clay. And so I would use Sculpey as well, but you had to be very careful what you were making. You had to imagine where the mold line was, because it had to slip in and out of this metal mold with no give. So you were continually learning new skills and new ways of doing things. And that moved on to when we really got into plastics in a big way. And we were using the freeform system with a haptic arm.
Right.
And I was still making the 3-up, excuse me, the 3-ups I was still making from Sculpey. But then they would go and they would get scanned. And the scan would go into the computer. You know, you would see it on your screen. And then you had the digital thing where you could, it would tell you where you had undercuts, where you had to either fill or take away, or, you know, you would be able to, you would lay it out in a way that would mold well, and you could add digital clay or take digital clay away. And it was although you had to be aware when you were sculpting, it took a lot of the guesswork away from you, because you pressed a button and it told you, you know, where there were problem areas. And you could fix it. But that again was a progression from the basic making a green. And you knew you had to make it not totally flat, but you couldn't have an arm going out the front like this, or it would have to be separate. You know, you knew that there were certain rules for that through each stage that had its different rules up to the digital age. And so you were constantly learning and working out what made a good miniature, what made a successful miniature, looked good, still looked three-dimensional, still had all the detail you wanted. And, you know, that was done over a number of years, really. Yeah.
Because it sounds like the technology obviously opens loads of doors and makes loads of things possible, but then also is introducing new restrictions and those kinds of changes. That's where the adaptation is coming from.
For me, it was definitely a restriction. I mean, I didn't enjoy digital sculpting in the same way. I mean, I did use it. So I used freeform for a number of years, but to me, it was putting a screen between me and the material. And I've always been somebody who likes to get my hands dirty. I like working with clay. I like the tactile qualities, and I like the way it looks different from a digital sculpt, because you cannot get that perfect symmetry that you can digitally. There are kind of areas, I won't say mistakes, but there's obvious areas where a human hand has been on the material.
Right.
It just looks different. As well, you know, you're seeing it at the actual size that the person who's buying it and painting it is seeing it.
Right.
With digital, you're often, you know, you've got the ability to pull in close, and you can be adding all this stuff that actually, if you're not careful, you're putting too much, or you're almost changing. I mean, the guys at Workshop now, they're fantastic. You know, they know exactly what they're doing. But to me, the digital lost a lot of the qualities that I loved about traditional, which, you know, is one of the reasons that I went and I'm doing my own traditional stuff now, you know.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So just jumping back, I guess. There was a point in time where you and
tell
Aly...
me if I'm randoming off and odd.
No, it's lovely. It's great. It's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I was just curious then about that period where Marauder was created. And I guess starting with just like, where did the idea come from? Was that something that Bryan suggested?
That was something that Bryan, so hey, you guys, we'd like you to do this sort of thing one day.
Right. Okay.
Well, basically, when we started the workshop, it was fantasy. That was it, And Aly and I both loved doing fantasy. There was, the odd things like Judge Dredd and Doctor Who and various things, but basically it was your standard classic fantasy. And then 40k came in and took off like a bat out of hell. It was amazing. And a lot of the designers had gone over to making pretty much all 40k work, and fantasy was getting left by the wayside. And it was still popular. People were still buying it. And so one of the reasons for Marauder really was the fact that Aly and I worked well together, obviously, being married, and our styles were quite similar because he taught me initially. Our styles were very compatible. Mm-hmm. And so Bryan said, right, we'll have this separate little company where you'll concentrate on fantasy. That'll be yours, pretty much. You'll do the bulk of that. And it was twofold. It was having it as a separate little company worked well because we could have our own salesman. We could have our own little, very, very small team. And there was a lot of trade outlets that were maybe a little bit reluctant to take Citadel by this time because, you would have to take so many of this, so many of that.
Right.
And a lot of it was, like I say, the 40k, and they might not want that. They might want fantasy. But it was another way of getting more effectively Games Workshop into more different places. It was again, the more bang for your buck, isn't it? We were, to the outside world, a separate company.
Yeah.
But we were still really Games Workshop.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious about that. So, like, structurally as an organization then. So was Bryan Ansell still sort of at the top and was like dictating, okay,
Yeah.
And would
we were left to our own devices.
So you could just go, we want to do this, we want to do that.
It was almost, we were really given carte blanche in a lot of ways to do stuff, which was, that was fantastic because as Workshop had got bigger and Citadel had got, more designers and we're making more stuff. And you began to, there were maybe more people who wanted to do one range, so you didn't get to do something that you wanted to do, or you got to do a little bit of it, or, they wanted this release. And so everything was pushed to that release. And it was a little less sort of, it was a little more structured. It was a little more, it wasn't bad, but Marauder was, you've got all of fantasy, make it. That was basically it. Here's your fantasy world, what's gone before. So it can be a Marauder miniature, but it has to be compatible with Citadel. But make it.
Yeah.
Go for it, Yeah. And
was there an attempt to make it compatible with other stuff as well at that time, or had it really moved away? It's like pure Warhammer now.
Well, Warhammer was becoming bigger. It was becoming a much bigger thing, and really anything that we were going to do was going to be to Warhammer's advantage, not to another company's advantage, if you like. It still had our look. People could look at it and say that's a Marauder figure. And we didn't always necessarily follow exactly what might have been made before then, but it wasn't so far away that it didn't, fit in general with the fantasy ranges,
Yeah. Yeah, because actually, looking back at the sort of evolution of certain ranges, it seems like things that you were doing at Marauder really did have a long-lasting impact on
they
the
did.
range, whether it's the Landsknecht.
Yeah.
Like that
yes.
feels like it came not necessarily only from Marauder, but there were definitely a lot of Marauder miniatures using that style.
Yeah, I think I don't think that was necessarily something that we consciously did at the time, but we were taking things and, you know, we would decide, okay, you know, we're going to make the ogres, or we're going to make some orcs, we're going to make something. And so we would do all our own concept sketches and things like that. We had a salesman, we had a chap in who was our mail order guy. So, you know, he was busy packing mail order parcels. When Mark Farr was one of our sales guys, who now does Footsore, who produce, you know, all my stuff now as well. He's a lovely guy. But we would take it, and if there wasn't really a strong image already for it, we would almost make an image for it. So it was like with the ogres, you know, Aly was obsessed with Lanchnecks. He loved them. I want to do some Lanchneck ogres, you know, and he cursed himself, you know, having to do all that slash and puff. And, but, you know, it was things like that became, you can look at stuff that's now coming out maybe with the old world more than Age of Sigmar and stuff, but you can see where some of the beginnings of it was Marauder, the figures we were making at Marauder. And it didn't really click at the time, to be honest. But that's, you know, that's the way it went, you know.
Yeah.
We found the imagery that kind of worked.
Yeah. And
that people then ran with and adapted and changed, but that little germ is still there in the centre, you know. So it's lovely to see, actually, you know. I'm proud of that fact, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, and even now, you know, we're seeing in that the old world, like you mentioned, the ogres, for instance, the Marauder ogres, they're back and available.
That's right.
They had a long lasting legacy.
Yeah, the giant.
Yeah, of course.
You know, there's been, I think, the Pegasus, the Marauder Pegasus as well. You know, there's quite a few seeing the light of day again, and you know, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Just to see that stuff that was made way back when, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, and it's still loved, you know.
Yeah. What led to Marauder sort of coming to an end? What was the decision making that sort of ended the Marauder run?
Well, I think in some ways we might have been a victim of our own success, because, you know, it was like 5 years we did it in total, and Colin Dixon had joined us latterly. Bless him. He's very much missed, as Colin. But yeah, he joined us and we were selling really well. We were becoming really popular. And I think we'd managed to give fantasy a bit of a kick. That it was, you know, people were interested in it. And so it was just, the decision was made to absorb us back in to the main Citadel again, you know. And the Marauder figures were still, for a while, sold as Marauder, but then sort of a lot of them got absorbed back into the main ranges.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the reasons. There could have been other reasons that we were never privy to. Who knows, you know. But I think, you know, in some ways we were a victim of our own success. And I think, I mean, Aly and I would have continued to do Marauder.
Yeah.
You know, we were quite upset when it was sort of thing, well, you know, it's going to end, you know.
Yeah.
Because it was wonderful to have that little thing to do, because we still had ties, you know, we'd pop back in and out to the studio. We still knew what was going on and were involved to a degree, because we had to know what they were doing so that we weren't overlapping, or that we were filling gaps. We were also filling gaps in ranges that Citadel hadn't done, you know.
Yeah.
So it was a real shame in some ways, but you know, we take it for what it was. It was a wonderful time, and it was a great insight into our business, and gave us the opportunity to be more involved. I mean, we used to help out with the phones occasionally, if you know, to sell, to trade, if Mark was really busy on one phone, and you know, if we were doing a games day or something, we'd be selling the stuff physically ourselves, you know, with a money belt round, and you know, we were more involved with the whole process.
Yeah. So I mean, it sounds like it was much closer. Like you were running it like running the business to a large degree as well.
Yeah, we were a lot more involved
Yeah.
with that side of things. Yeah, yeah.
'Cause would you have been responsible for the like budgets and things like that, or was
No,
that still
no, no,
within
we were no,
Bryan?
no.
Sure. You
We
did do
just
a Marauder painting competition though, didn't
we
you?
did we did one, the Marauder Blade. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That was good. Yeah, but after that was run, and then unfortunately, Marauder was no more, so we couldn't do any more. But yeah, that was like a mini a mini golden demon, very mini.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean things like that. It was great, and we had our catalogue and we had flyers coming out, and it was nice. It was you felt an ownership and an involvement in it in a way that you didn't with Citadel, because it was you were an employee of Citadel. And
Sure.
yes, to a degree, we were an employees of Marauder, but we were also a lot more involved in some ways. So there was a different feel to it. Yeah,
So
yeah.
how did that sort of feel then going back into the Citadel fold?
Um, it was strange in a way. I mean, in the 5 years, it had increased
Hmm.
in size and the amount of people who were working there in general. And, certain things had moved on a lot. But because we were still in touch and still going into the studio and, still friends with all the people, it wasn't like starting a new job, if you like.
Sure.
That's a tale there.
Yes. Yeah. Martha's arrived.
Keep you warm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a little bit strange because again it was a situation where going from having a little bit more ownership of what might be getting made, thinking I would really like to make this, and being able to have the ownership of it and how it looked and to a degree and all that sort of stuff. We were now back more into a situation of this is what we want you to make now.
Right.
So there was less freedom in a way.
Yeah. That must have been
Which
tough at times.
it could be, but it was an exciting time at workshop. So you kind of just got involved with what was going on.
Yeah.
It was, but yeah, it was different. It was different going back again. It did feel a little bit strange for a while.
Sure.
But it didn't take too long to get back into the swing of things.
I'm curious as well about like when like your journey then sort of progressed into doing a lot more of the sort of bigger monsters.
Yes.
So like was that something that you were keen to pursue, or was that that there was just a need for that? We need someone who can
Um,
specialize in that.
well, originally when I started, Nick Bibby was the guy who did all the monsters. I mean, he's fantastic. Nobody can do creatures like Nick. Such a talented chap. And then he left, and I had an interest in that sort of stuff, and was a bit obsessed with dragons and such like because I'd loved dinosaurs for so long. And so, if there was a chance to make a big creature, yeah, yes, please, I want to do that one. And I mean, Marauder was nice in some ways because I got to make a lot of 28 mils again. I got to make full ranges like of orcs and elves and things like that, not just the creatures that were involved with them. But yeah, I suppose like any company, there's a certain amount of pigeonholing goes into things. But in my case, it was kind of it was a pigeonholing that I didn't mind.
Right.
I always enjoyed making the creatures, just from my love of them, and it was like I was quite happy, if somebody was making the range and then I would make the beasts to go with it. And I was quite happy doing that because, to be fair, that's what I really enjoyed more than anything. And I liked working bigger, slightly bigger as well.
Yeah.
I could stick more detail in there. I could get ridiculous.
And that only got sort of bigger and bigger because obviously you went to work with Forge World.
Yes.
Some of the Forge World stuff is like the scale of it's massive.
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yeah, huge.
And they're quite. I imagine.
Sorry. No, particularly that last dragon I made before I left.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask about these.
Biggest
So some of those
enormous
miniatures with loads of detail.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, how long is it taking you to do like the Dread Saurian, for instance, like a project like that?
Oh, I mean, it's always difficult for me to say because at that time, when I had my daughter, I started to work 3 days a week, and I never went back to working a full week after that. I was always 3 days after that. So the amount of time it took me would be longer.
Sure, just a bit, yeah.
Than, but yeah, I mean, they were big projects, and they could take a good few weeks, so 2-3 months sometimes to make.
Right.
I mean, that last dragon, it was done over the course of a year, really, with lots of backwards and forwarding, and I did the odd thing in between stuff, but yeah, they could take quite a long time to do because we were, you would start with concept sketches, and in the case of these larger ones, then you'd make a maquette, which was often full size, just not fully detailed, but enough to see the pose, see some of the details, the look of it, and then you'd go on to making the actual beast itself. So yeah, they could take a good while to do. But for me, it was like going back to my roots, going to Forge World. That was really the reason I wanted to go there. I think if I hadn't been able to move to Forge World, I might have left Workshop at that point.
Right.
Back in 2012, because I really wasn't particularly enjoying working digitally. It just, the engineering side of things is a bit of an arcane sort of thing to me. I don't think that way. My brain doesn't work that way. And just generally, like I said, I was missing having clay to work with. So being able to move to Forge World was like going back to when we started working for Citadel. It had the vibe of an early Citadel, an early GW, the way it was run, the people that were there, again, a smaller team. And it just had that community vibe about it again, which I loved. And I was getting to get my hands dirty again and getting to do what I really loved. So,
That's great. Yeah, because was it then mandatory within the Citadel studio that you had to work digitally by that point? Like there was no way to... Right. It just...
it became fully digital.
Right.
It did. And, although I probably could have stayed and done it, I don't think it'd have lasted long. I mean, I just wasn't enjoying it.
Yeah.
So Forge World was a no-brainer, really. And luckily enough, they wanted me. So,
I'm actually, just on a sort of technical question, you're going to have to forgive my sort of layman question on this. But when it comes to creating like a big dragon or a monster or something like that, obviously that's then when you buy it is in multiple pieces that you then assemble. How do you go from having sculpted the full thing to having those pieces? Are you literally cutting the original?
I cut it up, yeah.
Right, and it's literally you're just taking a blade to it and slicing
effectively
it?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
It's scary.
Yeah, that sounds scary.
I know some people do actually sculpt bigger things like that in bits.
Right.
Personally, I don't like doing that. I like to see the whole thing in front of me.
Right.
And because I'm using polymer clay, I don't make like we used to do, start from the feet. You build the feet, the clay would, the epoxy would dry off, you'd build the legs, then you'd clothe it, sure. Then you would put the stuff on top and, with polymer clay, one of the things I love about it is the fact that you can put clay over the whole model. You can work a bit on the, say on the head, and what you do there might slightly make you want to adjust a bit down here. You don't have to carve offset putty. You can just adjust. And to me, I get a figure, excuse me, at the end of it that looks right because I'm able to work on the whole figure. So I prefer to do it that way. That means, of course, that it has to be cut up afterwards, which is somewhat daunting. Not so bad maybe with something the size of one of my tree men or something. That's relatively small, but certainly anything bigger. Basically, once the polymer clay is baked, I would cut it up after it was baked.
Right.
Otherwise, trying to cut, you'd be squashing detail all over the place. It would just be a nightmare. You'd ruin it. So I would bake the piece. Had a huge big like toaster oven to bake some of the big things. The only thing that was separate in some things were the wings. They weren't built on the creature. They were built separately. Then I would get all these homemade tools, and to cut through set Sculpey or beast putty like I use now, it can be, when you slice through it, it can be very difficult, and it can be quite brittle, and bits can shear off. So, excuse me, you have to heat the putty again.
Right.
So on something smaller, basically a bowl or a mug, boiling water, dip it in, let it heat up a little bit. That makes the putty more almost wax-like, and allows you to just slice through it, just like butter.
Right. Wow.
So you slice a bit. Obviously, with huge, big things like that, sometimes you'd use a heat gun just to carefully, without burning it, carefully heat the bit you wanted to cut.
Right.
And then you'd start to slice round. And because the knives the scalpels I was making were from a razor blade, they were flexible. So you could actually get quite flexible lines. And then you'd get to a point where you could start to wobble the piece, you could start to move it around, and you would feel where the wire armature was in the center.
Yeah.
And sometimes you could just twist that piece until the wire just broke off.
Right.
Sometimes you could just move it to get a jeweler's saw in there and cut through the wire. So it was an interesting period. It was scary, because you knew if you mucked it up, it was an absolute nightmare. But then what you got was two pieces that still fitted really well together, if you were lucky and nothing had, split off. And then I would take that, and I would use a Dremel to onto the female side, what was going to be the female fitting, to Dremel out the hole where it was going to be.
Right.
And then I would use maybe a piece of plastic, not plastic card, but tube or milliput, something or other, to glue onto the other side. And then it was a case of I would use an epoxy putty to join them in the fittings, and it was a case of just pushing in, a lot spitting on it to sort of stop them sticking together, which is disgusting, I know, but it works. And and then getting the fit as perfect as you could, letting it all dry, and then the last thing would be any little bits that needed touched up, just going around and touching it up. So it does make it a long process compared to, say, digitally, where you cut and you've got a beautiful cut. But to me, it works because I can see the whole creature when it's finished. And as I'm making it, I'm thinking of where those cuts are going to be.
Right.
At the
That's
end of
actually
the process.
informing the design.
Yeah. So that's the way that I do it. Other people do it differently, perhaps, but that's what works for me.
Yeah, gosh, that's incredible. I mean, it sounds like I think I'd be too anxious to get into that state. I'd be just afraid of destroying everything.
I've got to be in the right mood. No coffee, no coffee beforehand, so my hands don't shake. A very large coffee afterwards, and I'm sitting up here in my studio. My husband will be downstairs, and he knows if something's gone wrong, because the rather unladylike language will start. I'm running up and downstairs to get more boiling water from the kettle, and it's a whole
yeah,
it's an interesting procedure. But it works in the end. It works.
Yeah. Well, evidently, yeah. I mean, it obviously comes together in the end.
Yeah.
I asked my patrons if they had any sort of burning questions for you, and there's some great ones, and we've covered off some of those as we've been talking. But there were just a couple more that I thought I'd quickly run past you. I mean, one was when you were working at Forge World, there was, for instance, there was the Fimir matriarch was snapped at an open day, and it was never released. And I guess it was just, were there any other miniatures like that you were working on that just never saw the light of day, or for one reason or another?
No, not so much with Forge World. Most of the stuff, I think, got released for Forge World. It was more frequent with Citadel.
Right.
That, you would make stuff, and for whatever reason, whether, the sales guys decided they didn't like it, or they decided to cut the range for a financial reason, or it didn't fit properly in the rules, or there were various reasons, or it just didn't mold properly, or it's not unusual really to have figures that wouldn't be released,
right?
Which is why there's such a froth these days about getting, they would often be cast, and there would be casts floating around, so people get very frothy about getting one of the unreleased stuff. I've got in boxes here, I've got greens and clay sculpts, that I made that just decided not to use them, so I've got quite a lot of unreleased stuff lying around in places. it's not unusual when you're making the quantity of stuff that for one reason or another it won't be used. It's quite frequent.
Sure. I got a couple of quick fire. Just which about you prefer sculpting or working on? So one was dragons or griffins.
It would probably have to be dragons, because doing wings on things like griffins, I mean, it's bad enough doing dragon wings, but doing wings with all those feathers is enough to just drive you completely up the wall. I mean, it's just a nightmare. Yeah. And it's something I put myself through every now and again and curse the whole time,
Minotaurs or trolls?
Trolls. Definitely. Trolls have the humor, that mad humor and just goofy, but nasty at the same time. Yeah, trolls, definitely.
Witches and hags or big beardy wizards?
Oh, good grief. Yeah, witches and hags. I my ambition in life is to become a crone, an old hag. I'm well on the way to it, so it's got to be witches and hags, Life goals.
Because I think you worked on some for these both of these ranges. So like Space Slan.
That's right. Yeah.
Lizard Men.
Oh heck! I think I always loved doing the slan.
Yeah.
There was something about frogs, Aztec frogs, that just who wouldn't love an Aztec frog?
Yeah.
So I probably have to say slan. Yeah. Yeah. Be they space or otherwise. Yeah.
Was there actually a favorite range that you had from across your time?
It's so difficult.
Yeah.
It's so difficult. I mean, so many of my things were part of a range rather than a full range. I mean, if we go back, I mean, I'd have to say there's a few. Let's say the Beastmen, my first Beastmen, will always have that sort of, my babies, because they're the first thing I did, and very proud of them at the time. And it was like, oh yeah, I'm a real designer now. I've had something released. So yeah, ranges. I've always loved doing trees. Funnily enough, I think that's pretty obvious these days. So things like doing the tree men and doing things like the Ents for Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. So ranges of tree men and the elves, that would go with them. Yeah. But a lot of it was things like the animal stuff. I loved doing the Fenrisian wolves. That was a fantastic one to do, making those wolves. And then just generally, sometimes it just changes depending on, whether there's a Y in the end of the day. It's like, sure. One day I'll have one favourite, one day I'll have the next.
Of course.
I think if I had a choice of what I could make, it would be a tree man or a dragon, usually.
Sure.
Simple tastes.
Well, they're classics, aren't they? They're great.
Oh, they
great fantasy beasts, both.
Yeah. It gives me an excuse to go out and spend days out in the woods taking photographs of random trees that have faces in them,
Yeah. And you actually you mentioned Footsore before, and the miniature ranges that you're working on these days.
Yes.
What sort of stuff are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, Footsore, I'd got back in touch with Mark, had asked me to make stuff for Mortal Gods Mythic, which I'd done quite a few pieces for that. And then I'd been thinking towards, I really wanted to make my own range. I had lots of ideas. So I started making the HarrowHyrst range, and Mark said, I'm happy to, cast them, mold them, cast them, and produce them for you, which, works really well. Mark and I go back a long way. I won't say nice things about him because he'll get really big-headed, but we go back a long way. So now, sorry if I'm getting diverted again. So yeah, I have my own stuff now, and I can just make what I like.
Yeah.
And basically for me, it's a world that has been in my head from a long time, way back from the Grimm's fairy tale books that I used to read, right up till now, of... When I say fairy tales, I don't mean the cutesy fairy tales with Tinkerbell. I mean the dark, folklore-based,
the
she, the fae, and what I just want to do now is make things that mean something to me, that I enjoy making, and populating this little world of mine. And it also means since leaving workshop, I've done a lot more, taken up painting watercolors and things. So, I can paint the characters. I do all the backgrounds for the photography. And I've discovered this felting lark, which is, we were on holiday, and we have a motorhome, and we travel as much as we can too. And it was a horrible, wet, nasty period. We were down in Henley, I think. Was it Henley? Somewhere like that. And went into this little craft shop and bought a little kit for doing a felting thing, just to keep me amused while it was raining.
Yeah.
Oh, this is great. And I thought, and then I made a tree. I thought, I'm going to see if I can make a tree. So I made a tree, and then all of a sudden it was, I wonder if I could make terrain. And now, quite a lot of my time I spend making the felted terrain that I then photograph the sculpts on, and I paint. I'm trying to paint everything I make. So now I can say to myself, I really have got my own world, because I've made the inhabitants and painted them the way I want them to be. I'm making their environment, whether it be with felt or with a painting, and the whole thing is me and mine. And it's like this world has suddenly, it gives me such joy. This world has come about now, and there's nothing nicer than just sitting up here, making my world, making my headspace. And I'm very lucky to be able to do it, and I love it. Sorry, did I go off piste again there?
No, that's absolutely perfect. That's great. Yeah, I mean, it is a wonderful world, and HarrowHyrst has got so many amazing miniatures you've created there. I actually got the Quercus, I got that for Christmas, and I'm very excited.
It's that's something I always wanted to do at workshop, was make a dragon that was actually made of bits of the forest, but
which is amazing.
They never wanted that. They always wanted like a serpentine or a chaos dragon or something. But now, it's like, now I can finally make, my chaos dragon.
Yeah, because it feels like it is from those, exactly like you say, those fairy tales, those folk tales, the darker ones.
That's it.
Yeah, it feels like it belongs to it. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing, that of all the things, that's what interests me. It's not the sanitized version of anything. I like the proper, slightly dark, slightly scary fairy tale.
Yeah.
And that's the world that I want to create. But it can still be brightly coloured, and it can still have that kind of look to it, that kind of vibe. But there is a darkness there at the heart of it,
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm so happy doing it, I must admit.
Fantastic. That's great.
Wonderful.
Trish, this has been absolutely wonderful.
It's been lovely to chat to you.
It. So thank you so much for taking the time. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been lovely. I hope I didn't go off piste too often.
Not at all. No, I think it's all fascinating stuff, and all just so many interesting insights. So I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me on.
Well, thank you for coming along. Massive thanks to Trish for joining me to share so many amazing memories and reflections about such an incredible career. It was a real joy to chat, and I'm so grateful. Thank you very much, Trish. If you would like to find out more about Trish's current range of miniatures, the HarrowHyrst monsters, you can check those out via the link in the description below. I would like to thank my Patreon supporters for helping me to prep for this interview. If you would like to help me prep for future interviews to get early and exclusive access to content like my living research posts, where I delve into unexplored histories of niche topics within the Warhammer world and Games Workshop history, you can get all of that by supporting me on Patreon. It's the only way I can keep doing this work, and I'm enormously grateful. Thank you once again to Trish. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.